During this period, we had to undergo the severest test of all, to pull back without having been defeated. 1,000 times the question was asked, why are we going back? Never to be answered satisfactorily. Commanders were continually being asked by their men to explain this move, which was inexplicably and irrevocably threatening to destroy what had been the mainspring of every soldier's life, the success of our arms and his confidence in victory. In addition, there was the fact that this gigantic withdrawal, with its deliberate creation of a dead and empty space by yielding territory, often without contact with the enemy, contained within it the gravest dangers to discipline and morale. There were endless herds of cattle streaming back past our men, poultry and livestock being carried west in countless thousands, whole mountains of valuable goods lying unguarded by the roadside, waiting for transport. Then there were the civilians, trekking slowly along the railway tracks, carrying the trains laden with the unending flow of grain. Kilometre after kilometre of young girls in their teens, women with children at their breasts, and men all with one thought, to escape the death advancing from the east in the form of Bolshevism. What army could have withstood a withdrawal of such dimensions in its 5th year of war without suffering serious damage, or even the considerable disintegration of its psychological and organic integrity? Dangerous as this withdrawal was for the rear services, it provided a test of purgatorial dimensions for the fighting forces. Stalin, of course, concentrated for the pursuit every man who had survived the heavy fighting of his Ukrainian offensive and was trying at whatever cost to turn this unprecedented migration of millions of souls over hundreds of kilometers to his own decisive advantage. Occasionally, the enemy would not follow up at all, and our movements took place without enemy interference. Then he would throw in everything he had to break through our defensive screen, penetrate into our bridgeheads, and make a cheap haul out of our retreating elements. But he never succeeded. Despite the difficult strategic and tactical situations into which this plan, by its very nature, was bound to bring us, the enemy was at no place and at no time able to disturb our intentions for any length of time, let alone thwart them. This deliberate withdrawal from the Donez to the Dnieper was one of the greatest operations undertaken in the history of war. Never before had a command placed itself so completely in the hands of the troops. There was little it could do to mitigate their hardships or ease their psychological anxieties. For tactical reasons, it could rarely let the men know even the operational objectives or the direction of march. There was only one thing for it to do: place a blind confidence in the German soldier. And he never betrayed that confidence, carrying on even when he neither understood nor could understand the orders given him or the command that issued them. In the course of this withdrawal, it became clear that the German soldier had outgrown the mere obedience of the parade ground and had attained a state of absolute devotion to duty. We soon saw what our withdrawal meant for this unhappy country in terms of individual lives. He had joined our company many months before, attached himself to us sort of like a stray dog in one of the many villages we had captured. At first he was everyone's favourite, but the spice soon had him put on kitchen duty. There he stayed, the young Shura Machugin from Poltava, a 13-year-old boy whom a Komsomol unit had dragged to the front. One of our units had taken him prisoner, but it had released him on account of his age. It was not long before he was speaking amazingly good German and settling down to the daily routine as if he had always belonged to the company. When the division advanced east and took up positions beyond Poltava, Shura took to slipping away at frequent intervals to his native village, which at that time was just behind the lines, to return shortly afterwards with a sack full of eggs, so that we were never sorry to see him go off on one of his trips. It never entered our heads that he might not come back, or might even desert to the enemy. Shura was the most dependable person you could imagine, both in his work and even, if men were short, in battle. For that reason, the mood of the entire company was even gloomier when it was suddenly discovered in the middle of the major withdrawal that Shura had vanished without a trace. "Man, oh man, can you believe it?" the mess sergeant said angrily. "Shura of all people." Even the company commander was upset. The spice growled. "Just because we're going back this time, who would have thought—" He turned down the many volunteers who came in. "No, Shura was enough. Day followed night and night followed day, and train after train rattled westwards, laden with the grain. The countryside reverberated under the hooves of tens of thousands of cattle, all moving west. Night was turned to day by the light of blazing towns and villages, which, deserted by the people and laid flat by fire, would no longer offer shelter to the oncoming Soviets. As the endless file of peasant carts drew past, a man would every now and then point to one of the many boys riding on them. "Looks like our young Shura." We came to a riverbank. Farther upstream there was a continual procession of farm produce, machinery, refugees, and of course troops pouring across a bridge. A large ferryboat was shuttling backwards and forwards at our crossing point. During the previous few days we had been withdrawing steadily, covering the allotted distance each day, almost without enemy interference. But now that the Russians seemed suddenly to have realized that we really meant it, they were making desperate efforts to catch up with us and take possession of the riverbank themselves. Everything was ready for the crossing. The combat trains were all ready, and the first platoons on their way over. Then the ferry returned once more to carry the last platoon across under covering fire from the opposite bank. The first Russian assault groups had already reached the river on either side of our debarkation point. The whole platoon was quickly aboard. Russian artillery was firing too high and dropping its shells far behind us into the water. Our infantry guns were replying in kind, all very much like gunnery. Fortunately, the river was wide. Suddenly there was a shout from the men watching the bank we had just given up to the Russians. A boy had appeared among the Red Army men, then another and a third. "If that isn't Shura, I don't know who is. If we get a direct hit, it won't matter anyway," said another. "One shell will be enough." He reached for his sniper's rifle. "But at least we'll give him something to remember us by." He took aim and then lowered his rifle. Over on the bank, the three boys had suddenly run to the water's edge, dived in before the Russians had realized what was happening, and were swimming with long strokes after the German ferry. The men crowded to the stern of the ferry, which then threatened to capsize. Two of them untied a boat and rowed to meet the swimmers halfway. The barrage was forgotten. Nothing mattered but the three foolhardy young swimmers. Just as our ferry touched the bank, having come unscathed through the hail of fire, our two men dragged the first of the boys into the boat. German machine guns kept up a tornado of fire, putting down a complete screen of fire over the boat, which, endless minutes later, also reached the bank unharmed. One of the boys had been wounded through the arm. It was Shura. Before the medical orderly had finished bandaging his arm, he was already greedily swallowing his first bite of bread. "Please don't be angry with me, Nastchalnik," he begged our company commander. "But when we started pulling back, I couldn't stand it any longer. I simply had to go home and see my mother. But the Bolsheviks had already occupied our village and either taken away or killed all the men and women. Only my two brothers were left, hidden away in one of our hideouts. I found them at night and we set off straight away to catch up with you. We tried all the time to find a gap in the Red Army we could slip through, but it was impossible. We didn't give up, though, but slept during the day and went on trying to find a way through at night until we found you, just before the river. And now," he finished his story exhausted, "now I've found you at last and everything's going to be all right." He tried to say something else, but sank limply back and was asleep. The men stood in a circle round him and said nothing. Our spice picked up a shelter half and put it gently over the sleeping boy. And this is the story of old Babushka, just one portrait among many, the portrait of an unknown, simple Ukrainian woman. But for me it is a memory of the great river. "1,000 thanks," said the ancient Babushka, bowing low over and over again, so low that I feared she would bump her head on the ground. We watched amused as she hastily picked up the big pot with the remains of the chicken soup we had been unable to eat and disappeared with it through the low doorway. At midday she was back, and so it happened that the old woman took to coming every day to fetch the leftovers for herself and her 4 grandchildren. 2 of her sons were in Siberia, a third had been killed in the Red Army. Her 2 daughters-in-law had been taken off by the Bolsheviks to dig defences, and she was left alone with 4 perpetually hungry grandchildren. She was soon known to the whole company as Babushka, little grandmother, but we were not the only givers. She too gave in her own way. There might be an enormous hole in somebody's socks, which she could still mend far more quickly than any of us, in spite of her old fingers, or perhaps a shirt or a pair of trousers to be washed. There was no need to tell her. She came unasked day after day and mothered us all in her own fashion. But it was the serious, taciturn Rudolf whom she took most to her heart. Probably because, as she said, Rudolf had the same blue eyes as her son Jacob, who had gone to Siberia 5 years earlier. At that time, we had been holding a narrow wedge that we had driven into enemy territory and were going to give up again shortly afterwards under the overwhelming pressure. It went without saying that all of us knew the situation and had reckoned with this withdrawal. In the end, it turned out as it always did, everything in a mad rush. We just thought ourselves lucky to be getting our personal items out at all. Just as our personnel carrier was rattling out of the village, Rudolf muttered angrily to himself, "You idiot, I've left my old shirt with Babushka." Things were very hot for the next few days, and many a good man fell on that sandy soil, so that those at home could continue to live and work. The broad Russian heavens stretched their gentle fields of glittering stars in cloudless nighttime skies over the graves in the east, and held watch over their quietude. Our taciturn, brave Rudolf also waited somewhere in the vast expanse of the east for the bells that will ring in peace throughout the world. Shortly after Rudolf's quiet death, we counter-attacked over the bare stubble of the freshly harvested sunflower field where he had died and threw the enemy line back by retaking our old village. The women and children lined the roadside the same as the first time, but the glow in their eyes was gone, their smiles frozen. We walked through the familiar streets, asking about this and that person. Suddenly we found ourselves in front of Babushka's small house. There was no sign of life. Old Waska from the hut next door slowly dragged himself up to the low wooden fence. "Babushka kaput," he said in a flat voice. "Many kaput." He pointed with trembling fingers to a tattered brown rag that fluttered like a storm signal from the low gable on the roof. "God damn!" Wilhelm cried. "It's Rudolf's shirt." My story is short, just as life is mostly short in Russia, and there is no happy ending, as there is none to Bolshevism. The Red Army commissar who had taken over the village saw the brown shirt on the gable where Babushka had always dried our laundry. Perhaps a small-minded person had begrudged the old woman the food she had taken from us and denounced her. But perhaps it really was the shirt that betrayed her. "You've helped those Hitler swine," the commissar roared at the frightened old woman. "You've betrayed the world revolution." It did not help her that she cried and said that the children would surely have starved if the Germans had not given her food. And whoever eats must work. Didn't the great comrade Karl Marx say, "He who does not work, neither shall he eat"? So Babushka was shot, together with all the other traitors and fascists, those shirt washers and sock menders, and even the old man who had gone so far as to cut wood for the mess. And because they had cried and clung to her skirt, the 4 children had had to accompany their grandmother on her last long journey. Silently, we trooped into Babushka's house, where we took a yellowed old photograph showing her in her younger days from the wall. We sent it as a memento to Rudolf's mother far away in the west. When, a few weeks later, we were forced to evacuate the village again in order to shorten the front, we pulled the burning embers out of the stove and into the dry straw. No one who came here under the blood-red flag of the East was going to find a roof over his head in this house. At the edge of the village, we stood silent a moment and looked back at the burning house. Rudolf's tattered old shirt fluttered from the gables, engulfed by a cascade of flying sparks. Then we moved off to await the enemy in our new line. Later that day, I happened to overhear a Sturmbannführer say casually, "No need to waste any pity on that scum." He must have gathered from my expression what I felt. "Maybe you don't agree?" My throat felt parched, but I managed to say quietly, "Sturmbannführer, I don't." He looked at me in astonishment and then turned and muttered something to his adjutant about German sentimentality. The rest of the men crowded round me and shook my hand in silence. At about that time, I began to notice from the whole attitude of the company that a profound change was taking place amongst our men. Both officers and men of the fighting units were beginning to examine things, and to arrive at conclusions very close to my own. It was only in the places where the decisive orders came from that all appeared to remain completely deaf and blind. However, the severity of the fighting and the stupendous enemy superiority did not leave much time for discussion, let alone thinking. Over and over again we attacked, and again we threw back the enemy hordes. But it was always the same story. The enemy yielded under our pressure, but thrust forward again on either flank, forcing us to give ground to avoid being encircled. Our losses were heavy, because our blood could not make up the missing east wall, with its concrete pillboxes, deeply echeloned trench lines and strongpoints. What tremendous stories, both official and unofficial, had been concocted about that wall, and though it would not have surprised us to find that things were not exactly what they had been made out to be, to find nothing whatsoever, nothing but this fantastic make-believe story that was too much. For the first time, I was overcome by fear. I felt like a man deserted, fighting in a hopeless cause, and with me the entire German army in the east. In front of us a pitiless, treacherous enemy, quick to exploit his every chance, and behind us a command that lacked all understanding of the enemy's real nature and sacrificed every opportunity it had to paper programs and obsolete ideas. I was faced with the greatest decision of my life. We had received the appeal of Seydlitz and Company, showered down on us in millions of leaflets. The spectre of Tauroggen was on the prowl for more souls. The sudden appearance of this National Committee of Free Germany and League of German Officers came to us in the east, prisoners and fighting troops alike, like thunder from a clear sky. Erich Weinert, German communist leader and writer, and Walter von Seydlitz, the bearer of a great Prussian general's name, had given their names to the organization of an intellectual German revolt behind the barbed wire fences of the Russian and Siberian steppes. Then, later, a new name began to be heard, faintly at first, but then with increasing force, a name which to the German people personified the fate of hundreds of thousands of our Stalingrad soldiers, the name of Generalfeldmarschall Friedrich von Paulus. There is no denying that this revolt was brilliantly planned and executed. Conceived in the Politburo with all the craft and experience of the elders of the Kremlin commissars, its foundations were the two tenets of Bismarck's political testament. Never to expose Germany to the danger of war on two fronts, and support for the traditional idea of a Prusso-Russian alliance, the whole being given lustre by the historic Prussian breach of faith at Tauroggen. Among the millions of German prisoners, the reaction was surprisingly weak, especially among the non-commissioned officers and men. Apart from the thin layer of political opportunists and turncoats, it won very few adherents, and those were mostly incorrigible German romantics, who derived their inspiration less from the tragic figure of the forsaken Stalingrad marshal than from the legendary rebellion of Generalleutnant Yorck and his officers. Among the German soldiers fighting on the Eastern Front, the reaction was outright rejection and deep contempt. Nevertheless, the galaxy of brilliant names of the officer rebels burst like a thunderbolt on the astounded ears of the German soldiers and prisoners in the East. There was Seydlitz, of course, and Generalleutnant Edler von Daniels, Oberst van Hooven, Oberst Steidl, General Major Cortes, General Lattmann, Major von Frankenberg und Proschitz, Major von Nobelsdorf-Brenkenhoff, Oberleutnant Gerlach. And since the Soviet strategists naively believed that the Germany of that time had to have an unknown corporal, there was plain Gefreiter Emmendorfer, bravely lined up alongside all that eminence. But the name that really shook the Eastern Front soldier was that of Friedrich Paulus. This relatively young general, who had once been Reichenau's chief of staff and had been appointed personally by Hitler over the heads of a number of senior generals to succeed him, had at one time been the most hated of all German generals by the Russians. It had not been so long since Ilya Ehrenburg, Stalin's personal journalist-in-waiting, had named Paulus the Butcher of Kharkov, because he had used force to crush an incipient revolt in that city. His volte-face was a mystery, yet not even his example could do anything to lessen the morale of the German Eastern Front soldier. Behind it all were the grinning masks of Stalin and Kaganovich, their aim the Bolshevization of Europe. It was all too obvious. Even though our way may have been wrong, were we to expose our country, countless women and children, to that threat? Though we were marching to our doom, could we fail to hear the call to duty and loyalty given us by the graves of our comrades, ploughed up and destroyed by the Bolsheviks though they were? I decided to continue the path, to continue it to the end, however bitter, though with seeing eyes and doing all that was in my power to do. Perhaps a higher power would spare me the results of the defeat and place me with my silenced comrades. I decided in the knowledge not only that our road was wrong, but also our guide. But were we not trapped? Were we not caught in a net far more terrible and embracing than anything the Soviet divisions could contrive for us? The net of our own awakening realization? How was it indeed possible for a person to know everything, to see everything, to feel everything, and do everything? This deification works only as long as nothing stronger appears on the scene. But when it does, the lack of a real bond uniting the community has its effect, because everything waits for the one man who is expected to work miracles, even though he is only human, with human virtues and human weaknesses, simply a man. One man may certainly take bold decisions and sweep the whole people along with him, but the same one man may also blunder and err and drag the whole people down with him. The way of the community, halting and bumpy though it may be, is slower whichever way it leads, uphill or down. The eyes of many see more than the eyes of one, the ears of many hear more than the ears of one. No, never again totalitarianism that I swore. If only we could once avert this mortal danger, if only we could throw back Bolshevism, then we would unite with all our strength for the revolution of reason. The sacrifices we were having to make at the altar of the Führerprinzip were too great. And back then I still had no idea whatsoever of how great those sacrifices had been. It was just at this period, during the agony of doubt and indecision, that the affair of the dying deserter took place. We had seen the Russian regiments mown down in front of our machine guns hundreds of times. Hundreds of times we had been faced by the riddle of this war in the East. How could a people, tortured and oppressed as no others in the world, be so ready to die for their torturers? Of course, we did not find in the Red Army man the same conscious devotion to duty or the same understanding of the ultimate truth that our own men displayed. But that utter disregard of their own lives, that ruthlessness towards their enemy and themselves alike, was a riddle we had never answered. If the Bolshevist experiment had succeeded in anything, it was in the mechanization of living. From the Stakhanovite-influenced worker whose very sleeping and waking, whose laughing and crying, whose meals and digestion must be reduced to a norm if he is to attain his target, to the Red Army soldier and his way of fighting, all things show the triumph of materialism and mechanization. The heart is dead, and the soul of the Russian peoples dies before the muzzles of the execution squad, and yet everything goes on its appointed way in its appointed mechanical order. Though enthusiasm is dead in the men of the Red Army, the men who must pay the reckoning for those whose account is unsettled and likely to remain unsettled for all eternity, these same Red Army men fight and die like wound-up puppets, like robots, for problems that are not theirs and phrases that they have never understood. They die as they have lived like machines. We sometimes found that enemy defenders would cover us with a hail of fire from their automatic weapons, right up to the last moment, and then jump out of their holes, throw away their rifles, and ask us with a cheerful grin for papyrossi cigarettes. Sometimes companies yelling the Ura battle cry would carry their attack to a point just short of our lines, and then, what was left of them, would crawl across to us through our fire to offer us their rifles and ammunition. With my own eyes, I have seen Russian prisoners snatch up the rifles lying around to fire on a Soviet bomber that had chosen us for its target, the very same prisoners who, a short time before, had been fiercely and stubbornly defending their line against us. Dusk was upon us. We were positioned on the slight rise from which we were to carry our attack forward next morning into the frost-covered terrain ahead of us. There was a howling, bitter wind that constantly stirred up a dusting of frost. Suddenly, our outposts saw a man fighting his way through the storm. "Don't shoot!" the Unterscharführer shouted. "Let him come in!" At that moment, shots were heard from the other side, and the man dropped, either wounded or dead. "A deserter," we complained. "Shit!" Shortly afterwards, a patrol of 3 men crawled out in front of our lines to find him, but they were soon back. Although badly wounded, he had gone on dragging himself towards our lines. The medic examined him and shook his head. Stomach wounds, 3 of them. Later in our dugout, with his wounds roughly dressed, the deserter waved away our sympathy. "Nichevo," he said, almost to himself. "Better this way than the other." I lit a cigarette and pushed it between his lips. "Ukrainian?" I asked. He shook his head. He had been a worker in the Urals and had once upon a time believed in the fiction of liberty, equality, fraternity. But that was long, long ago. "But why then?" I asked. "Are you all so willing to die for the system?" The mortally wounded man breathed heavily. "That's something you'll never understand. Never. The backbone of the Red Army was not the commanding officer, not even the specialist. It was the politruk, or, to give him his full title, the Polityczny Rukovoditelь, the political commissar. In the smallest unit, which was the platoon, his function, according to regulations, was performed by the pompolitruk, who was assisted by what was known officially as the informatory, 3 or 4 informers whose identity nobody knew, not even the platoon leader. The informatory was made up of ordinary soldiers selected by the pompolitruk and required by him to report their comrades' every conversation and every move, however harmless. It was practically impossible in the Red Army to say a single word without its getting to the ears of the politruk. The politruk proper worked at the company level. If he had done long service, he may have held the rank of a starshi politruk. In the battalion, the work was in the hands of the battalioni commissar. In the regiment, polk of the polkowy commissar, who similarly may have held the rank of a starshi polkowy commissar. In the brigade, it was the brigadny commissar, in division the divisioni commissar, in corps the korpusnoy commissar, and in a field army, the armyski commissar pierwogo ranga, that is, 1st grade. Over him, he had the armyski commissar vterogo ranga 2nd grade. On top of this hierarchy of super-informers, all of whom wore an official uniform and were regarded as at least the equal of the officers, sat the Supreme Political Commissar of the Red Army. All the threads of that endless and deadly web ran together with him. None could escape from it once they were caught in its meshes, and that meant every Red Army soldier, every man, was helpless in the face of this chain of spies and traitors. "You think you've found a friend and pour out your heart to him?" the deserter whispered. "And perhaps he really is your friend. It's just that he is also one of those involuntary bloodhounds who stir up and hunt the masses of peasants and workers who have been herded together. Suppose he has a heart and doesn't report you. Then the politruk is told by another informer, who perhaps doesn't even know the first, that the 2 of you have been having a long conversation. Then come the questions, until finally your friend breaks down and lets out part of what was said between you. That is the end. Next morning you are liquidated." The sound of a shot came from the distance. "It might be an outpost," the wounded man said hoarsely, "or it might be the politruk's pistol having the final say. You're under the magnifying glass day and night, and whatever you do is seen and heard. And then you ask why the Red Army is so ready to die for its hangmen? The net holds us all prisoner, all of us from the greatest to the humblest, from our first steps in the barrack square till our last tumble into the mass grave." Our shells rumbled overhead, and farther down the line an anti-tank gun barked. The dying man turned quiet. But before he left the misery of his wretched life, he opened his eyes once more. "Break it," he whispered. "Break open the net, you Germans." Over by the woods, Red Army men were shouting their last hurrah for their Bolshevik masters. But the deserter heard no more. We lay by our rifles and listened to the sound of massed dying. Right in the middle of the difficult fighting retreat, which was casualty-intensive, the news reached me of the death of Franz Roth, one of the most successful combat photographers for the German side in World War II. A short while later, orders reached me in the Kirovograd area to move to the capital of Croatia, where a new corps was being formed, the 3rd SS Panzer Corps. This formation was to consist mainly of volunteers from the Germanic countries, Holland, Flanders, Denmark and Norway. Its commander was to be General der Waffen SS Felix Steiner. I was both happy and sad to be leaving the Eastern Front after nearly 3 years. I had often envied my comrades in Italy and France, having the time of their lives in Biarritz and Capri, while we had to spend our days and nights dodging death in the Russian steppe. Yet for all that, I felt a touch of sadness and melancholy. There is a curious, haunting quality in the wide Russian landscape. It repels and enthralls at the same moment. It sickens a man and yet leaves him yearning. Even today, after years of unimaginable horror and strain, there is hardly a man who has served on the Eastern Front who does not at some time feel a nostalgic yearning for the unending space of the Russian land and the boundlessness of the Russian character. But my stay in Croatia was to be short, mercifully short, for it was the same there, the same sorry story of one mistake after the other made by our command. An order came taking us away from the fertile fields of Croatia, away to the far north, to Bridgehead Narva. We detrained at Jovi and moved by motor march to the narrow bridgehead, which stretched little more than 2 kilometres wide across the deep blue waters of the Narva. Columns of black smoke and flame were belching up from the opposite bank just across from Hungerberg, the Estonian seaside resort on the Gulf of Finland, where one of our shells had scored a direct hill on a Russian fuel depot. In front of us, in Narva itself, however, all was quiet. There was a lull all along the front, and the silence was oppressive. We felt that all hell might break loose at any moment and shatter this unaccustomed calm. Soon we began to encounter roadside warnings. Road under enemy observation. Warning! Road under artillery fire! A column of wagons drawn by small, shaggy horses moved unconcernedly down the dangerous stretch of road. Then shells began to drop on either side of us, but we got through unharmed. We made it to an improved road, with the first buildings of Narva on each side. "Godverdom," a sentry called out. "That was a near one." It was a Dutchman of the Netherlands Brigade, which was standing guard in that area. Then we entered Narva, that strange and mysterious city of northern Europe, which has been fought over and stormed so many times in history, and has yet survived through the centuries into our own time. Standing between the ambitions of 2 worlds, Europe and Russia, its walls have forever been ringed by war and destruction. All that was left of its beauty and splendour was ruin. Barrage fires and bombing had transformed this pearl of the north into one of Europe's worst rubble heaps. Yet the magic of its past still lived on in some of its winding lanes, in the midst of its shattered houses. The old gate of the city church still vaunted its 6 skulls and 2 fiery torches, and the cupids still looked down from the gateway of the Fon house. The stork standing on one leg on the tower of the city hall still looked out with distrust towards the east, the origin of the continuous metal greetings of the little red father to his beloved Estonians. And towering over all were the twin symbols of this gallant old town, the Hermannsfestung and its younger rival Ivangorod, symbols of the struggle which, throughout the centuries, has been inseparable from its life. And now today again, Narva was once more the focus of North European history. The city of Narva was founded in the 13th century by Germanic tribes, principally the Danes, as a bastion against the rising danger from the east. Some time later, it was taken over by the Teutonic Knights and enlarged into a major European stronghold against Russia. Its biggest tower, the Long Hermann, was erected under the Grand Master of the Order, Hermann von Bruggen-Hassenkampf. Opposite the fortress rises Ivangorod, massive and defiant, visible proof of Russia's determination never to renounce her claims on Europe. Legend has it that Ivan III, Grand Duke of Russia, engaged for its construction a Greek architect whom he then rewarded for this unique achievement in the Russian north by having him blinded to prevent him from ever again attempting a similar task. Narva saw the victory of the 17-year-old Swedish king, Karl IV, over a Russian enemy 4 times his superior. It also saw the crushing defeat inflicted on the Swedes by Peter the Great, who made Narva a Russian town for centuries to come, not unlike Dorpat. Not until 1918 were German soldiers to march once again into the age-old citadel, only to leave it again in the fatal November of the same year, after which the Bolsheviks occupied the undefended town and installed their terror regime. Then Estonian, German and Finnish volunteers, fighting side by side with the regiments of the White Russian general Yudenich, finally beat the Bolsheviks back and pushed on deep into Russian territory. Estonia's independence, which the Soviets were then forced to recognize, lasted a short 20 years, after which the hordes from the east again streamed across the Narva and, under thin pretexts of security, occupied the old Estonian and German lands. In August 1941, it was once more the German soldiers' turn to throw the enemy back across the Narva, Northern Europe's eternal bulwark against the east, and pursue him eastwards towards Leningrad. After the many German withdrawals and the shortening of the front, Narva had once again become the gateway between Europe and the east, just as it had been 700 years before. In dugouts and trenches, in pillboxes and out in no man's land, men in the ranks of the Waffen-SS from all the Nordic countries were fighting side by side with Estonian volunteers for the survival of Europe. Thus Narva remained, right into our own troubled times, what it had been for centuries past, the key to Northern Europe. The future of our continent would be decided there. This was the dividing line of the world. But we were not the only ones to realize this. The Bolsheviks did too, and launched attack after attack in their bid to win this heap of rubble, and thence strike the final blow against Northern Europe. Savage air attacks swept over the town and our bridgehead. Sudden barrages were dropped on our line in order to undermine the morale of the defense. Soviet tanks tried to force their way through to the strongly defended riverbank. But it was all in vain. The men whose ancestors had once fought under the Teutonic Knights, who before that had conquered under the Danes and the Dutch, threw back the Russian masses and held the tiny Narva bridgehead like a breakwater in the midst of the Red Flood, forcing the Kremlin to postpone its grandiose plans for the redistribution of the Baltic regions. The Estonians, fighting for their native land in the ranks of the 20th Waffen Grenadier Division, coined a bat that became the watchword of the whole Narva front. Out of the rubble grows revenge. The Kremlin had little to hope for in that sector. Fighting together for freedom, side by side with the Dutch and Norwegians, the Flemish and the Danes, stood these descendants of the old military frontier established by Prince Eugene, descendants of the old pioneers and settlers from all German districts. From the Banat and the fertile Bachka country, from the forests of Transylvania and the Romanian mountains, they had come here to the far north in the unaccustomed surroundings of North Estonia to defend their families, their homes and their country, their bloodlines and their empire, and had proven themselves magnificently. Between these men from the southeast and the men from the north and west, fighting together at Narva for the future of Europe itself, there grew a comradeship and a bond, the bond of a common experience, a common danger, a common fight. The Russian shells did not always fall on their target, and despite the best efforts of their gunners, the spire of the city hall, so reminiscent of Amsterdam and Haarlem, still stood proudly intact above its shell-pitted roof. "It's all the same now whether they hit it or not," said the old washerwoman who acted as mother to the company. "Narva is dead." The German church had been badly damaged, and only its massive corner buttresses, still blinding white, told of its former Baroque beauty, created by industrious hands in the 17th century. Also in ruins was the ancient Bourse, where once the courage and endurance of sailors, peasants and soldiers had been transformed into golden coin. Of the old apothecary, only the bare front wall was still standing, rather like a bad stage set. Here and there among the rubble of vanished houses stood a gracious old gateway, a striking contrast to the ruins around. The dates chiselled into the facades from more than 4 centuries told of the wealth of this old fortress town on the Narva. Quick swallows soared past us, straight and swift as arrows, turned and climbed steeply into the arch of the sky. They came to Narva with the late spring, as they had always come. They had seen the King of Sweden reduce the mighty power of Russia to ruin. They had swooped round the stonemasons building Hasenkampf's Long Herman, and soared above the blinded Greek as he cursed the Tsar in front of his own creation, the mighty fortress of Ivangorod. They had seen the hammer and sickle rise and fall, and German battle standards flying alongside the blue, black and white flag of the brave people of Estonia. And still they came, nothing deterred them. Neither fire nor smoke, neither bursting shells nor the battle cry of men throughout the centuries. War, sorrow and joy came and went and came again. But in the late spring the swallows returned to Narva. The iron crosses in the cemetery stood out black against the pale glow of the northern night. Stars twinkled through the roof of the big chapel, shattered by a Russian shell. Golden icons lay scattered about the floor. We picked our way carefully across the churchyard with its flowers and blossoming trees. The narrow path was churned up by shell bursts, and many of the trees lay broken and dead across our path. Generation on generation of the burghers of Narva lay buried here in the churchyard of the old Hanseatic and Teutonic town. Germans, Swedes, Danes, Dutch, Estonians. Here and there a white Russian officer or a priest. The song of the Sprossers, Estonian cousins of the European nightingale, sounded insistent and magical through the grey night. Above us the chug and groan of heavy shells. Forward in the sap, a machine gun rattled. Again the moan of shells, close this time. We threw ourselves down among the graves, and the hail of shrapnel spent itself harmlessly above us. As I stood up, my eyes fell on a big cross. Jacob Nicodemus Buddha Merchant and Seafarer of Narva, born the 21st of May. The year had been effaced by shrapnel. Only the epitaph was legible. All thou canst give, O Lord, hast thou made mine. Joy and sorrow, work and strife. Give, O Lord, to those who follow the greatest in life, joy and sorrow, work and not least strife. Some hours later, as I was on my way back to my billets, we decided to make another attempt to decipher the date of this curious dead man. We were spared the trouble, because the cross had been shattered to fragments by a Russian shell. At the other end of the town, towards Krenholm, 2 wooden houses were blazing, like giant torches in the morning wind. A small group of Dutch engineers marched down the road, singing. In the middle of the clear morning, birdsong rumbled the distant sound of our heavy guns. The old washerwoman was wrong. Narva was not dead. It lived. Its beauty shone out from its ruins, from the rubble inside the Baroque gateways, from the elaborately carved dates, from the haunting charm of its landscape. And what gave this old town its life and strength was its age-old, unbroken spirit of resistance to the east. We were positioned close to the enemy, in places no more than 35 meters from their lines. Dead silence reigned in the narrow strip of shell-torn land between us and the Soviet sap. Only occasionally did a heavy shell rumble across our positions. Once in a while, off to the right, we heard the rapid staccato of the Hitler siren, as the Russians called our machine gun. Then silence, heavy and oppressive, dropped again over the spectral landscape. Rain fell in a steady monotony out of a pale grey sky. Water stood knee-high in the trenches and gurgled over the edge of our rubber boots. Undeterred by the weather, men stood here and there in the trenches, gazing motionless towards the Russian line. For hours at a time, sometimes the entire day. Often alone, sometimes in pairs, one with the field glasses, and the other resting to save his strength for the strike. A youth's eyes gazed hard and cool towards the enemy trench. From the corner of his mouth came the whisper, "Nothing out of the ordinary to report." 2 men were walking, bent and stooping, along the trench towards us. They straightened a little as they passed, and in the same moment a sharp report rent the sodden air like the crack of a whip. We ducked. Who wanted to die in the dreary grey of a wet morning? Again the death-like silence came down, and we went on our way. But the sniper team in the front line at Narva stood motionless, gazing into the coming day. There were more of them farther along the line, this time 2 boys from Transylvania, Rudolf, aged 19, and Michael, aged 24. We talked to them about their homes, about the war, about everything. Rudolf's father was a hunter, his brother a hunter's. He had it in his blood, put a gun in his hand, and his eye looked for a target. Michael had seen his first hunt while still a boy. Now they were back at hunting stand, but here the quarry fired back. We only have to fire occasionally, but we have to hit when we do, Rudolf said, his eyes alight. Otherwise, we give ourselves away. A Bolshevik showed himself in the opposite trench. A quick aim crack. He fell forward. Had he been hit, or had he merely ducked for cover? More hours of waiting, and then at last a target. Another shot. The man on the other side stopped and finally tilted over backwards. A pencil mark on the wooden dugout walls. That one counted. I asked what they thought about as they stood there, crossing them off one after the other. That guy won't be shooting at my comrades anymore, or at me. Sometimes the opposite numbers across the way spotted one of our snipers. Where was he? Once the target was sighted, a duel developed in which every conceivable trick was used, every scrap of cunning. A whole magazine might be fired off from a feint position, then a quick dash back to the old stand to see if the enemy would reply. Once the position was located, it was usually the end of the duel. Sometimes it was our man who lost. Then another took his place as the eyes of the forward line, behind whose vigilance the others could afford to relax. One evening, in this bitterly contested Narva bridgehead, we had an experience that instantaneously showed us something of the Soviet mentality. In the falling dusk, Dutch and ethnic German SS grenadiers stood at the parapet, watching tensely out into no man's land. The Russian barrage had lifted, and they would be coming at any moment. A pale fog billowed out of the vegetation and the spit of woods. In front of us, Ivan was laying smoke to cover his attack on our company's forward position. Nevertheless, our bullets were soon cutting like a swathe into his ranks from all sides. Artillery laid a barrage beyond them, and the remainder of the force that had penetrated our position was flung back at the point of the bayonet. A few dozen Red Army men had paid with their lives for Stalin's world revolution. Some time later, one of our patrols went out to reconnoitre towards the woods, where we had seen strange lights flickering. They oriented on them. They stopped in surprise at the sight of the first of the enemy dead, who lay only a short distance in front of our lines. The bodies were charred and burnt. Farther on, they could see fires still burning in the grey night. Was one of them moving there? The Dutchman bent over him, but he was dead. Then the SS men realized what had happened. When the commissars saw that they could not bring in their dead, and probably even the badly wounded, they covered them with gas or some other flammable and set them alight. Forward, comrades, world revolution is waiting. And when the moment comes, a bottle of gas and burn faster, comrade. Burn faster. Papa Stalin not only needs your life, he especially needs your death. The next morning I had orders to report to SS Brigadeführer Wagner, a new division that had just been formed. The 14th Waffen-Grenadier Division der SS Galicia was in urgent need of officers and non-commissioned officers. I was posted to it, probably because somebody had remembered my feelings towards the peoples of the East. Anyway, I was to take charge of a platoon immediately. The division was to fight in Galicia. The only pleasant part about it, as far as I was concerned, was that I would be travelling by way of Vienna and would be able to see my wife. Back in Vienna, I was surprised to find what little idea most people, even my closest relations, had of the true situation in the East. They talked all the time about our wonderful new weapons, the secret weapons. When I ventured to point out that we had never actually seen any, badly needed as they were, I was brushed aside impatiently with gestures of disbelief. It even went so far that I almost came to blows with my father-in-law, who was an old captain in the militia. They all knew the situation so much better than I or my comrades did, although we were unfortunate enough to represent the Eastern Front. The accounts I gave of our acts of injustice and political insanity met with a flat disbelief. Resentful, I held my tongue. As so often before, I felt a sense of relief to be moving east again. It was in Krakow that I first heard the fantastic rumour that things weren't too good in Lemberg, Lvov. It was then my turn to disbelieve. Wasn't Lemberg supposed to be the great strategic defensive focal point of immense psychological importance for Galicia and the Galician SS division? I tried to find out more about it, but there was no more information to be had. To be on the safe side, I cut my stay in Krakow short and was on the move again a few hours later. One station outside of Przemysl, the old historic fortress town of the Habsburg monarchy, the train suddenly stopped, and a major appeared accompanied by a horde of military police, all in steel helmets and shouldered submachine guns. A fine martial sight, almost too martial. Combat teams are being formed here to seal off a temporary breakthrough. The men on the train looked at each other knowingly. So there was something wrong at Lemberg after all. I made my apologies to the major and showed him my movement order and special pass. He was equally apologetic, but said that no exceptions could be made. I pointed out that I was headed for the front, not for the rear, but I was wasting my time. This major was as keen on getting every last private as the devil is for an available soul. We were crowded together in bare and gloomy quarters, and left for hours with nothing to do but hang around and sleep. I was in a furious temper. Then, towards evening, we were entrained again, and eventually headed off for Przemysl. At first I decided to make a break for it, but on second thought realized that I would probably be unable to get through alone, although you could never be sure by then whether there really was an emergency, or it was just a flap with people throwing their weight around. At Przemysl, we were put into a large barracks, which at least gave us room enough to stretch out on the floor. During the night, an air raid alarm was sounded, and orders came round for all ranks to leave barracks and take cover in the trenches outside. Somewhere in the distance, tracer shells sprayed up from a lonely battery, and one or two tired Soviet aircraft crawled across the sky. A few small bombs were dropped a long way off. The whole thing reeked of the rear area. The language among the men and officers was colourful, to say the least. We went back to our rooms long before the show was over. Next morning there was still no news. Our numbers had grown to at least 3,000 men. If there really was an emergency, why on earth were we not formed into units and sent to the front? In any case, there was no firing to be heard, and a breakthrough without artillery was something new to me. Then, at last, companies and platoons began to be formed, and I was detailed as a platoon leader. For the first time I noticed that I was the only member of the Waffen-SS in the garrison. Once again, nothing happened. We lounged around the parade ground between the barracks and the other buildings, bored to tears. Strident military marches blared out of the radio all day. Suddenly an icy silence fell over the garrison. The words echoed clearly from the loudspeakers. A great crime prevented, the attempt failed, the Führer unhurt, the criminal revolt crushed. General uproar followed, in which only the officers were silent. Wild denunciations and reproaches were levelled against the officers who had contrived the plot. I said nothing. I was too shaken by the news. Gradually I became aware of an empty space forming around me. I stood alone, and knew that it was my uniform they were drawing back from. It was like a vision, lasting perhaps 2 or 3 minutes. Then they all began talking to me hurriedly and eagerly, as if to erase the impression. But I was able never to forget it. The music went on without a break. Then Goebbels spoke. About an hour later, as I was looking through the barbed wire around the garrison, beyond which we were not allowed to move, not even for a walk, I suddenly saw a Hauptsturmführer, whom I knew driving past in a vehicle. In desperation, I shouted out to him. He recognized me, stopped, and went straight to the major on my behalf. 10 minutes later, I was released from this curious combat operation. The Hauptsturmführer invited me to lunch and promised to get me transport to Lemberg. He told me that the new Galician division actually was encircled, and that there was heavy fighting in the outskirts of the western Ukrainian capital. Lunch brought a great surprise. The only other guests apart from myself were a Russian general, a close associate of Vlasov, and his young wife. She spoke fluent German, and with her help, the general and I started an animated conversation. His attitude to our political mistakes was also one of resignation. "You've made these mistakes and are still making them," he said softly, "because in spite of all your high-sounding phrases, you still don't realize the peril of the situation, both for yourselves and Europe. Bolshevism is something consistent and absolute, but you only talk about it and go on playing around with something between good intentions and indifference. Take the case of Vlasov himself. After he had already been chosen to become an ally of yours in the fight against Bolshevism, he went to the supply room of the camp he was in to ask for a replacement for the ragged trousers he was wearing. The supply sergeant initially bawled him out indignantly and then gave him the trousers. I always think of that story as illustrative of your Eastern policy. He paused a moment and then went on. Do you realize that 3 million Russian prisoners of war starved to death in the winter of 1941? I don't know whether it was some diabolical plot to annihilate us subhumans, or perhaps an administrative blunder, or perhaps only your famous indifference, which strikes me as almost Russian. If it was deliberate, then why didn't you save the anti-communists and deliberately liquidate the representatives of the Bolsheviks? That's what Bolshevism would have done in your place. Why didn't you just shoot them all systematically, or poison them, or get rid of them some other way? As it is, you've got millions of innocent people on your conscience, hundreds of thousands of them probably deserters, and you've lost the sympathy of the Ukraine in the bargain. But the Communist Central Organization goes on working quite happily and almost untouched. But let's suppose it was all a mistake. After all, that's not impossible. But where are the guilty? Where are their gallows? Punishment of these people might have given a new boost to popular feeling. But no, these incompetent fools were allowed to remain, and the most valuable political capital in the East was sacrificed to a pack of villains. Do you know what Bolshevism would have done in your place? It would have let these millions starve just the same, perhaps twice as many. But then it would have staged a show trial of its own agents, convicted them of deliberate sabotage on behalf of the enemy, and then had them solemnly executed. But you'll never learn. And that's why you're where you are today. I said nothing for some time. Our host was obviously embarrassed, because he too had no serious counter-arguments to offer. Eventually I asked, If this is the case, Herr General, then why have you thrown in your lot with us? He looked at me with his large dark eyes before he spoke in a melancholy fashion. Because I know Bolshevism, that terrible synthesis of madness and crime that holds my poor, unhappy people in its grip, all because our fathers once made the same mistakes that you're making today. Your Eastern policy has forced on every Russian a terrible choice. Red Bolshevism or brown Bolshevism, Nagin pistols or Mausers, and if there has got to be torture, suffering and death, most Russians, however much they hate the Kremlin, will choose the Bolsheviks, because they can at least talk to them in their own language. You mustn't delude yourself that those of us who've decided for Germany have done so out of love for you. We haven't. We've done it because we know that there isn't a hope of gaining freedom for Russia from within. We'll be satisfied with the part of Russia you leave us. Or if we aren't, then we'll fight against you for Russia's freedom once the Red Plague has been stamped out. But even if you Germans lose your war, we Russian patriots will not give up the struggle. Don't forget, we're not fighting for Germany, but for Russia. That conversation had moved me more that I let on. Later that afternoon, the Hauptsturmführer put me in charge of an ambulance, which I was to take up to my division. With 2 drivers, neither of whom spoke a word of German, I set off shortly afterwards for Lemberg, which I reached in the middle of the night. When I arrived, shells from medium Russian artillery were dropping in the streets and alleys of the town, and small groups of Martin bombers droned high across the night sky. There was not a single soul to be seen, far and wide. Neither civilians nor German soldiers. We drove slowly and cautiously through the streets of the dead city. In the light of our blacked-out headlights, I finally saw 2 unguarded German vehicles parked in front of a big building. I had the ambulance stop and pushed open the gate to the house. I heard the sound of carousing and raucous singing coming from an apartment on the 2nd floor. Inside the flat, I received a rowdy welcome. An Untersturmführer, whom I knew, a Hauptscharführer and 3 Ukrainians were having a good time. Like me, they had been trying to find the division and, tired of their search, had settled themselves down comfortably in a deserted apartment that had once belonged to a German officer. My drivers and I sat down and joined the others at the big table. About an hour later, I began to inquire about the situation from the Untersturmführer, who was quite drunk by then. But he knew as little as I did, having arrived from the same direction as I had only a few hours earlier. I was gradually beginning to feel thoroughly uneasy about the whole affair. I slowly walked out into the corridor. As I left the apartment, I heard another door closing quietly behind me, and from the floor above came the unmistakable sound of soft footsteps. Out in the street there was still no sign of movement. A few buildings were on fire in the distance, colouring the sky with a deep glow, and a salvo of rockets from a Stalin organ crashed down a few blocks away. Several bursts of heavy machine gun fire came from somewhere close at hand. I went back to the apartment and tried to persuade the Untersturmführer to make an attempt at establishing contact with our own fighting elements. But he would not hear of it at that time of night. It was too late. So I left the revellers to it. In any case, they were hopelessly drunk by then. Out in the dark corridor, I heard the same creak of a door. I stopped and pulled out my pistol. "Where are you going?" asked a faint woman's voice, speaking the hard German of a Ukrainian. "There's death waiting outside. None of us can escape it. But tonight we're still alive." A hot, almost feverishly hot hand groped its way under my arm. "Come in with me, German." After some hesitation, I followed the pressure of her hand into an apartment, which was as dark as the corridor outside. I struck a match, but she blew it out immediately. "Why do you want to see?" she asked, and led my uncertain hands to her firm breasts. "I'm young, and yet I've got to die." "Why don't you get away then?" I whispered back. "My mother is very ill," she said quietly. "She would die if I left her, so we'll just die together. It's better that way." "For God's sake, why do you keep talking about dying?" I said irritably, trying to shake off the gloom that lay heavy on me. "You're an Ukrainian, and they're your own countrymen who are coming." The young woman laughed softly. "I've loved a German. They shot off both his legs and he was taken away, far away to Germany, where he has a wife and 2 children. I shall never see him again. I've loved a German, and the NKVD shoots women and girls for much less. Come, stay with me. It's my last night. You needn't be afraid."